I'd like to talk about how I improved my portrait drawing with science, with looking into the scientific literature to see if what I could learn to help me improve my drawing. And everybody's had experience, and me too, about wanting to improve the drawing, improve portraits or caricatures. You can read books, you can look at educational websites, you can take classes, you can go to school, you can take a look at endless YouTube videos or online classes such as Udemy. So lots of different places to look. And talk a little bit about specifically about portrait drawing. I've always wanted to learn how to make portraits. I've always wanted to do better. And so I kind of wanted to just explore the possibility of looking at how science looks at this stuff. And to kind of get that started, you could look at portrait drawing involves visual processing, memory and brain function, and understanding facial features and anatomy and things like that. And so all artists work to improve things, and so they need to go look for information to help them improve. These topics, though, are the domain of psychologists and physiologists as well. And we might want to take a look at that set of disciplines, that domain, to see if that would help. Now, I'm not the only person to have thought of that. Specifically, we can talk about Margaret Livingston in the book Vision and Art, and as described here from the Amazon.com description. She's written a book about bridging the gap between science and art and exploring how painters work with paints and how that relates to her vision research. And for example, she gives the example of why Monet's poppies in the poppies field appear to sway. The book is about what research in the physiology of the eye can tell us about how artists do what they do and how they achieve their goals. A second example is drawing on the right side of your brain, which informs art instruction with research concerning right and left-handed brain function. Both books explore contributions of science to the understanding of the artistic process and increase our understanding of that process from a different viewpoint. And both books represent different approaches: neurobiology of vision and general brain processing. The question I wanted to ask was, are there other areas of research that could perform the same basic task? Study this area of research, see if it helps with art or drawing, in my case, portrait drawing. So the area that I got to thinking about was face processing and face recognition, which it turns out to be is a part of cognitive psychology. I myself am not a scientist. I'm a hobbyist, so I actually didn't even know what area to look at. So if I was interested in portraits or interested in caricatures, I had no clue what area of science might be relevant to that. But I tumbled onto the actual search term face recognition, which is part of cognitive psychology. So I was able to do a literature search for literally the term face processing and turned up numerous articles, including some on caricatures. And part of the reason why this body of knowledge exists is because psychologists are interested in how this relates to forensic eyewitness accounts, how people match faces when they're witnesses. And in this, scientists are studying the functions that are at the core of drawing, and vision, face recognition. What is a face? What does it mean to recognize a face? So these are all questions that are also relevant to an artist. An artist might ask about what's the best way to do a caricature? What's the best way to learn how to get a likeness when doing a portrait? Here's some examples of face processing literature results. Understanding characters of faces, coding spatial variations in faces in simple shapes, a test of two models, and face space, a unifying concept in face recognition research. Face processing has a lot to say about the stuff that would be relevant, so we've got some feeling in these articles from the titles that this might be relevant to drawing, to artwork. question now is, what can I pull from this that would help me draw portraits better? And would like to go ahead and follow one example and see where it leads. So the particular example we're going to look at is one called Configurational Information in Face Perception. And this is in the journal Perception from 1987. And to summarize it generally, we're looking at how looking at a specific experiment about how faces are perceived. The idea that faces are seen as a whole, and distinguish between facial features and the configuration of those features, and that face configuration information, how the features are organized, is important. So as an example of facial information and configurational information, we have an example of a picture by Giuseppe Arcimboldo, shown over here, which is called The Jurist, where we have a face that is assembled from frogs and fish and turkey legs, and yet you know that this is a face because the way these objects are configured together, we still know it's a face. And so it's the configuration of the elements that clues us in. So in this article, we can perform a number of experiments about how configuration is processed for faces. And specifically, faces of famous people were cut in half, and the top and bottoms were switched and composited. Then viewers were asked to map the top and bottom parts back to the original source, and the time to do so was recorded. So the experiment would be that you present only the halves in isolation, so people could associate those halves with identifying information, whether it was like, say, Margaret Thatcher. Then they were combined in a novel combination, top and bottom, that would resemble a real face. That was called a composite. Then they were presented with the top and bottom slid over in such a way that it would produce a combination, but it was a non-composite. And then the time to identify the top and bottom in each presentation was recorded. So here's a demonstration. The top half over here is placed over here, but the bottom half is put over here. And if there's any difference in thickness, that they're adjusted. So that's one stimulus. It's called the composite. And then this split image is called the non-composite. This was presented to the subjects, and they were asked to assign these parts, back to their original sources. And then they measured the time it took the subjects to assign the top and bottom halves back to the appropriate source for each input below. Experimental results were that the time to assign the composites back to their original source was statistically greater than for non-composites. In other words, it took longer to figure out where things were coming from if you were looking at a face that you interpreted as being a normal face. And this effect was lost if the images were upside down. So this composite, the assignment of the top half to the appropriate source, it took longer for the subjects to do it in this case than in the split case. And the conclusion was that the processing task of doing this assignment received interference from the composite being a meaningful face. Anything that broke the concept of faceness eliminated the interference. Whether, for example, there's an obvious split in the non-composite image, or whether it's upside down. So what I learned from this as an artist, and also as a non-technical person who doesn't really understand the fine nuances of the science involved, it reinforces the idea for me that the face is perceived as a whole. Likenesses are more than just the sum of individual parts. And so as I'm an artist, if I focus on face parts, on drawing the nose in isolation or parts in isolation, I'm not going to quite get a hold of the best way to do it. Whatever will make my drawing better is buried in how faces are perceived. That's another thing to learn. And also, further searches in cognitive psychology literature could prove to be useful. And in that regard, what would be next? Why don't I ask, like, what features are most important for discriminating faces? What features are most important for caricature artists? So is it most important when trying to get a likeness, to get the eyes, to get the eyebrows, to get the shape of the head? Which is the most important feature? Or which are the more important features? And if indeed it's true that these things fit together as a whole, what does that mean for an artist? And another question to ask would be, how is it that caricature artists can distort some features but not others? Why is it harder to characterize a typical face as opposed to someone with very distinctive features? Now, I can tell you right now that these are actually loaded questions, because I'm planning to do another discussion for another article which does try to address some of these issues. And it specifically does through something called the concept of face space. And if there is interest, I'll present that. So go ahead and like this video, and I'll see about presenting the next item.